the day Bernard Okafor walked into Whitmore and Crane Capital Management. For the first time, a woman at the front desk looked past him and asked if she could help the gentleman behind him. There was no gentleman behind him. Bernard stood there for a moment, not embarrassed, not angry, just quiet in the way that a man gets quiet when something confirms exactly what he already knew was coming. He adjusted the strap of his bag, stepped closer to the desk and said, "I'm the new senior portfolio director, Bernard Okafor. I have a 9 o'clock with Leland Whitmore." The woman blinked. Then she looked down at her computer screen, like the answer might be hiding somewhere in the keyboard. Let me just verify that." Bernard said, "Sure." He'd driven 4 hours that morning from Charlotte. He had 23 years in institutional finance. He had rebuilt a collapsing hedge fund in 2011 that made its investors whole when everything said it couldn't be done. He had a CFA, an MBA from Wharton, and a reputation in certain rooms that made serious men go quiet. And here he was, standing in a glass lobby in Richmond, Virginia, being verified. That was a Monday. By Friday, Bernard Okafor had learned the shape of the place. Whitmore and Crane was what people in finance called a boutique firm, which is a polite word for small, proud, and slow to change. Leland Whitmore, the founder's son, was 54 and had the soft handshake of a man who'd inherited his authority. He smiled too much and remembered names too carefully in the performative way that meant he'd been coached to do it. He'd hired Bernard because the firm's largest client, a pension fund out of Atlanta, had quietly insisted on it after a diversity review. Leland Whitmore had never said that out loud. He didn't have to. The rest of the team made it obvious enough. There were 8 analysts and 3 directors at the firm. Bernard was the 4th director and the only one whose office was on the 2nd floor instead of the 3rd. A temporary arrangement, Leland's assistant explained, while they finished some renovations. The renovations, Bernard noted, did not appear to be happening. Craig Sloan was the one to watch. Sloan was 41, 3rd-generation Richmond money, and he had the particular confidence of a man who had never once been made to prove himself. He ran the equity division, which overlapped with Bernard's new mandate in ways that Leland had been vague about during the hiring process. Sloan had blonde hair going silver at the temples, and he wore his collar open 1 button too many, like a man who wanted you to know he was relaxed. The first time Sloan spoke directly to Bernard, it was to ask where he'd parked. Not what he thought about the Q3 numbers. Not what his approach was to the pension fund restructuring. Where he parked. "Vista lots easier if you don't know the building yet," Sloan said, smiling. "They can be pretty strict about the reserved spots." Bernard had a reserved spot. It was in his offer letter. "I found it," Bernard said. "Thanks." Sloan nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's not really listening. The other directors were Pamela Reeves and Don Hutchins. Pamela was careful and professional and made a point of including Bernard in emails without being asked, which told Bernard she'd seen this before and was trying to signal something. Don was 60 and mostly checked out and spent most of his days on the phone with clients he'd had for 30 years. Neither of them was the problem. Sloan was the problem. Within 2 weeks, Bernard began to notice the pattern. It started small, the kind of small that makes you question yourself if you're not paying attention. Meeting invites that went out to the full director team except Bernard's address, then were corrected with an, "Oops, forgot to add you," when he mentioned it to Leland's assistant. A client presentation that Sloan revised the night before without telling Bernard, removing a section Bernard had written about long-term fixed income positioning. The section the client would later say was the most useful part of the deck, once Bernard reinserted it. An introduction at an investor lunch, where Sloan referred to Bernard as one of our analysts who focuses on the pension side, and then laughed like it was a slip of the tongue when Bernard corrected him quietly. Bernard did not make a scene. He did not raise his voice. He went back to his office on the 2nd floor and he wrote everything down. Date, time, what was said, who was present, what the context was. He kept the emails. He kept the calendar invites with the timestamps. He kept the original version of the presentation in a folder alongside the revised version, both with metadata intact. He had not survived 23 years in finance by being careless. The thing about Craig Sloan was that he wasn't unintelligent. He was just accustomed to a world in which certain things worked in his favor automatically, and he'd never had to think about why. Men like Sloan didn't scheme the way villains scheme in the movies. They just moved through space like they owned it, and they pushed, gently, in the direction of whoever didn't look like they belonged, and they kept pushing until that person either made noise or went away. Most people, over time, went away. Bernard Okafor was not most people. In his third week, a meeting was scheduled to discuss the Atlanta Pension Fund's mid-year rebalancing. It was the most significant client the firm had. The pension covered over 40,000 public school employees. Bernard had been hired in large part to manage this relationship. Everyone in the building knew that. The meeting was at 2 o'clock. Bernard was not on the invite. He found out about it at 1:15 when he walked past the third-floor conference room and saw the setup: water glasses, printed agendas, a projector already running a slide deck with the Atlanta Fund's logo on it. Bernard looked at the slide deck through the glass wall. The name on the cover was Craig Sloan's. Bernard went downstairs. He sat at his desk. He pulled up his email and looked at the original hiring agreement, the one that laid out his scope of responsibilities with the Atlanta account. He looked at the time, 1:20. He picked up his phone and called the Atlanta Fund's relationship contact, a man named Warren Ellis, who Bernard had worked with briefly years ago at a conference in D.C. and who had, Bernard now understood, been part of the reason Bernard got this job. "Warren," Bernard said, "I want to make sure we're aligned before today's call. Are you planning to ask about the duration positioning I flagged in the July memo?" There was a pause. "Which memo?" "The one I sent Leland 2 weeks ago recommending we shift allocation on the long bond exposure given the rate environment. It should have been included in your briefing materials." Another pause, longer. "Bernard, I don't have a memo from you. I have a brief from Craig Sloan that doesn't mention duration at all." Bernard was quiet for 3 seconds. "I appreciate you telling me that," he said. "Let me get you that memo directly before the 2 o'clock. He sent it at 1:34. At 1:58, Warren Ellis called Leland Whitmore and asked why the firm's senior portfolio director wasn't presenting at the meeting. Bernard was in the conference room by 2:01. He did not look at Craig Sloan when he walked in. He looked at the screen, set his materials on the table, and said, "Let me start with the duration issue, since I think that's where we have the most ground to cover." Sloan said nothing. He was very still. Leland Whitmore said, "Yes, please." The meeting lasted 2 hours. Bernard walked through the rate environment, the bond positioning, a reallocation model he'd built over 3 weekends, and a risk projection that showed what would happen to the fund over the next 18 months under 3 different Fed scenarios. The Atlanta representatives asked questions. Bernard answered them. Warren Ellis, on the phone from Atlanta, said at one point, "This is exactly the kind of analysis we were hoping for when we made this hire." No one in the room said anything to that. On the drive home that evening, Bernard did not feel triumphant. That's an important thing to understand about men who carry themselves with that kind of discipline. They don't celebrate the moments when they're forced to prove themselves. Those moments aren't victories. They're just evidence of the war. What Bernard felt was tired and resolved, because he knew with complete certainty that it wasn't over. Craig Sloan was smarter than Bernard had initially given him credit for. After the meeting, he backed off the direct interference. No more missing invites, no more revised decks. He became, in the language of the workplace, collegial. He stopped by Bernard's office once to compliment the reallocation model. He even carbon-copied Bernard on a client email he'd sent alone the week before. What he did instead was quieter. He started talking to people, the analysts mostly, young, eager people who were trying to figure out the firm's hierarchy and would adjust their behavior accordingly. Bernard noticed how Sloan would lean in doorways during casual moments, laughing, joking, and then lower his voice just enough when Bernard's name came up. Bernard never heard the specific words. He didn't need to. He watched the analyst watch him afterward, the way the room temperature shifted slightly when Bernard walked in. He watched Pamela Reeves stop inviting him to the Thursday lunches the directors did informally. He watched Don Hutchins, who had been perfectly neutral, suddenly start deferring to Sloan in meetings on matters that fell under Bernard's purview. And then, in October, Leland Whitmore called Bernard into his office and said, with the careful smile of a man delivering something he'd rehearsed, that the firm was evaluating the director structure and that Bernard's role might need to be recalibrated to reflect a closer collaboration with Sloan's equity division. Bernard sat in the chair across from Leland's desk and looked at him steadily. "What does recalibrated mean?" Bernard asked. We want to make sure the team is integrated, that there aren't silos developing. Leland. Bernard said his name once, quietly. Are you talking about reducing my scope on the Atlanta account? Leland's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes shifted. We're just exploring. Because my contract is specific about that scope, Bernard said. And I want to make sure that any restructuring conversation goes through legal review, which I'm sure you'd agree is the appropriate channel. Leland said, Of course, naturally, of course. Bernard went back to his office. He added the meeting to his notes. Date, time, Leland's exact phrasing, his own responses. Then he called a lawyer. Her name was Denise Quarles, and she was 47 years old and had spent 17 years doing employment discrimination cases in Virginia. Bernard had gotten her name from a contact in Charlotte. He hadn't called her when things started because he wasn't ready. He called her now because he recognized a threshold when he saw one. The campaign against him was moving from passive to structural. Once they touched his contract, it would take on a different kind of momentum. Tell me from the beginning, Denise Quarles said. Bernard told her. He talked for 40 minutes. She didn't interrupt him. When he finished, she said, You've been documenting? Every incident, dates and times? Dates, times, witnesses, follow-up communications. There was a brief silence. All right, she said. Keep doing exactly what you're doing. Don't escalate. Don't confront. Don't give them a reason to document anything on you, and send me everything by the end of the week. Bernard sent it all. What Denise Quarles saw in those files was a pattern she'd seen before, dismantled before, and knew exactly how to name. What made Bernard's case different was the precision of the documentation. Most clients came to her with memories. Bernard came with metadata. In November, the Atlanta Pension Fund conducted its annual review of external managers. It was standard process, a scoring rubric, a series of presentations, a final meeting. Warren Ellis had made clear privately that Bernard's work over the past few months had impressed the fund's trustees. The reallocation model had already started performing against projections. 2 days before the Atlanta review, Bernard received an email from Leland Whitmore informing him that Craig Sloan would be taking the lead on the presentation, given his longer institutional relationship with the client. Craig Sloan had met the Atlanta Fund representatives exactly once, at the 2 o'clock meeting in September. Bernard forwarded the email to Denise Quarles. She called him that evening. This is the one, she said. I know, Bernard said. Denise Quarles did not move immediately. That was the thing about a good lawyer. She knew when to let the other side commit further. She sent a formal letter to Whitmore and Crane's general counsel, not threatening litigation, just noting that Bernard's contractual responsibilities included the Atlanta account and requesting written clarification of any changes to that scope. The letter was careful, specific, and completely reasonable. The general counsel's response took 4 days, which meant they were nervous. It said the firm was not making permanent changes to Bernard's role. It was a hedge. It was also on record a denial that anything had changed. Then Denise filed. The complaint was with the EEOC, and it named patterns of racial discrimination in compensation, scope of work, access to client relationships, and professional sabotage. It cited 11 specific incidents with dates, witnesses, and documentation. It cited the September meeting removal. It cited Sloan's misrepresentation at the investor lunch. It cited the October conversation with Leland Whitmore and Leland's own words reconstructed carefully from Bernard's notes. The firm's response was to put Bernard on administrative leave. That was their second mistake. The first had been underestimating him. Denise Quarles amended the complaint that same afternoon to include retaliatory action. What followed was not dramatic, at least not in the way that people imagine these things to be dramatic. There were no shouting matches in hallways, no tearful confrontations, no moment where Craig Sloan stood in a parking lot and confessed his sins. That's not how it works. What happened was the slow, grinding machinery of accountability. Depositions, document requests. The moment when Sloan sat across a table from Denise Quarles and was asked to explain, on the record, why he had removed the duration section from the presentation and what he meant when he described Bernard as one of our analysts at the investor lunch, and whether he could account for the delay between the original Atlanta deck and the version he had submitted without Bernard's knowledge. Craig Sloan had a lawyer, too. A good one. But a good lawyer can only work with what you give him, and what Sloan gave him was inconsistency. Warren Ellis, When deposed, said that he had not received Bernard's July memo until Bernard sent it directly. He said the omission had raised concerns with the fund's trustees. He said the Atlanta Fund valued transparency in its external managers. Pamela Reeves, when asked to recount what she remembered of the Thursday lunches, was quiet for a moment before answering honestly. Don Hutchins, who had been closest to retirement anyway, had retired by the time the deposition schedule was finalized. Leland Whitmore's deposition lasted 6 hours. The settlement was finalized in February. Bernard had insisted, against Denise's initial suggestion, on a figure that reflected not just the harm done but the full value of his contract, his contributions to the Atlanta account, and a forward-looking component for reputational impact. The firm agreed. They also agreed, in writing, to a third-party audit of their HR practices and a revised scope agreement that made Bernard's authority over the Atlanta relationship explicit and unambiguous. There was a confidentiality clause. Bernard signed it. He was not interested in public performance. Craig Sloan was no longer with the firm by March. He had, as they say in Richmond financial circles, pursued other opportunities. On the day the settlement was finalized, Bernard drove to the office, parked in his reserved spot, and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Not the 2nd. Leland Whitmore had moved his office in January. He sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, and pulled up the Atlanta Fund's Q1 projections. There was work to do. That is the thing that people sometimes miss about men like Bernard Okafor. They think the story is about the fight, the documentation, the lawyer, the deposition, the settlement. People want that to be the whole story, and maybe it is satisfying in the way that justice stories are satisfying. But that's not what drove Bernard through 7 months in a firm that was trying to make him disappear. What drove him was the work. The 40,000 school teachers and bus drivers and cafeteria workers whose retirement sat in that fund. The rate curves, the allocation models, the specific and intricate problem of making a portfolio survive conditions that most managers weren't willing to think through carefully enough. That's what Bernard thought about when the room went quiet after he walked in. That's what he was thinking about. On the morning, the front desk woman looked past him and asked if she could help the gentleman behind him. He wasn't there to prove something to Craig Sloan. He was never there for that. The quietest person in the building was the one who understood, better than anyone, exactly what was at stake. And he wasn't going to let anyone take that from 40,000 people who were counting on someone to pay attention. He paid attention, and in the end, that was the only weapon he ever needed.